All righty. Book of Exodus. If you haven't already found your way there, go ahead and do so now. Exodus chapter 21 and into a little bit of chapter 22. For those who have opted to stay at home, hope all is well and you're joining us anyway. But we're in chapter 21, finishing up part of that chapter and then dipping our way a little bit into the next. So we'll pick up at verse 28, if you're ready to read along. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to the same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. When one man's ox butts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price. And the dead beast also they shall share. Or, if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. If a man steals an ox or a sheep, and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox, and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found, breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. And so, remember where we're at. We're working our way, starting at the end of chapter 20, now through all of chapter 21, into 22, maybe even a little bit into 23. We're looking at what's usually called the covenant code. The covenant code. This is not a set of laws in addition to the 10 Commandments per se. These are laws that explain the implications of some of those 10 Commandments. These are the what ifs. If this happens, what do we do? Well, wait a minute, what about this? And so it's dealing with some of those kinds of things. Already in chapter 21, we've looked at the question of how do you treat slaves? And we talked about the difficulties of interpreting that passage in light of our own preconceptions about what slavery is. And so we've looked at the treatment of slaves. Then we've also looked at, last week, a very nuanced approach to understanding capital crimes. Not every death of a victim is to be treated equal depending on the circumstances. Now we're in the final part of chapter 2 and making that transition, 21, and into the chapter 22. We're now looking at what you might label as property rights. What do we do about some of the commandments that might impact personal possessions? And so, by the way, notice, this is not in the handout anywhere, but notice Moses is writing about, God knows it's going to happen, but the assumption here is these people own personal property. There's nothing wrong with personal wealth. And for them, notably, where's their wealth at? It's the animals. The land outside your own village was common land, but your animals were your personal wealth. And so nothing in the Bible against having wealth accumulated so long as you don't greed over it or other things. So we're looking at personal property rights. Now, as we dip into these codes tonight, the first of these codes, this very first transition from murder to the animal, notice it involves what? Death and damage caused by the animals. And so it's a perfect transition point. It's a nice flowing way to move from death and murder, capital punishment, to, okay, what happens if an animal kills a person or does damage to other property? So let's go back and let's reread that first little paragraph. Or I guess it's technically the longest of the paragraphs, but not real long. But when an ox, so here's the animal, gores a man or a woman to death, there's the death of the victim, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall be or shall not be liable. Let's stop there for a moment, and we'll just start plowing through these. The basic gist of all these rules now is going to be, if you want to put it simply, that the owner is responsible for the animal's behavior. If you own an animal and it does damage to someone or something, you've got to pay. You can't merely go, oh, it's an animal, who can stop them? The gist is, you're the responsible party. The animal can't pay for the damage, so somebody else must. That'll be you. In the case here of the ox, talking about it goring somebody to death, immediately you know that this particular ox is a bull. It's a male ox. If it gores somebody to death, guess what it gets? Death penalty. The animal must die. The animal is not as valuable as the human that is taken. But think about, for the owner, some of the implications here. If he is, in fact, financially responsible for the animal in the behavior, you got to kill that animal. What did the owner just lose? Wealth. There's a great financial loss associated with this. If an animal accidentally kills Joe and we've got to kill the animal, you just potentially lost, think in our modern context, stud fees, possible meat sales, all kinds of things. Maybe it's your oxen that pulls your plow. Now all of a sudden you got to go buy another ox to do all that. So this is an expensive concept, that if your animal does this, it's going to cost you a lot. Puts the onus on you as the owner that you take responsibility for your animals. But notice, after the death of the animal, the owner is essentially free of any further responsibility. Now, it did cost you, so it's not like he's getting off scot-free, but he doesn't have to go to jail. He doesn't have to pay for the person's funeral or anything like that. His expense is the animal itself, and that's done. This is probably because the behavior described here versus what's about to be described in verse 29 suggests that it was very unusual for this animal. This is a random act of violence from an animal you did not expect it from. So imagine you've got a dog that's nice to everybody, and one day that dog bites somebody's kid. Out of the blue, never would have thought it. Everybody comes up, pets that dog, gets in his face. Oh, you can pet him, you're always safe. And that's the day the dog chooses to bite somebody's lip. That's the kind of scenario here. This animal we're describing is not known to be violent. You go, where do you get that? I get that from the next verse, because he's going to deal with something more specific there. Look at verse 29. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. And so now the scenario of the case is that if the animal has displayed violence previously, now the owner is responsible at a higher level, because he knew this animal was prone to do this, and he still did not deal with it. And so you're going to be held more accountable. In this case, if your animal, which has already stoned somebody in the past, and you didn't deal with it, right? You didn't kill it, and now it's gored somebody else because you didn't take proper responsibility, the animal and the owner are to be put to death. Notice how quickly that escalated. But the picture is, you knew better. You put this person at risk. You didn't pay the cost last time by killing the animal the first time it did it. And so you assumed all responsibility, and now it's therefore almost as if you killed the person. Because had you done what you were supposed to do, it would not have happened. The animal's owner should have prevented this, but he didn't. And so the consequences are now higher. So the first case, accidental, surprising, first, non-customary. Now this animal's known to do it. Here's what you do with this. But remember, this kind of law, this kind of case law that the Ten Commandments and these covenant codes are, remember I told you it's casuistic, if this, then that kind of approach. Verse 30 now adds even further nuance to it. Notice what it says in verse 30. If a ransom is imposed on him, the man, the owner, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. And so there's further nuance here. More what ifs that they're already thinking through and prepared for if something like this happens. Because if the owner, based on what we saw in verse 29, knew of the problem and didn't stop it, his life's in danger, right? There's heavy consequence to this. He took his chances, he lost. He had not, using the words from the text, kept it in. Here the picture is something else. First case is the animal just randomly does it, we're surprised. Second case is that an animal has done this before and you didn't stop it. Now this language of keep it in is a different scenario. If the owner's failed to keep it in, he's got to pay a fine instead. And you go, wait a minute, why has he got a fine if the animal still killed a person and this animal's done it before? Here's what's probably going on because of that language of kept it in. I'm like most of you, my first thought was, oh, he had it in the paddock, he left the gate open, animal got out. That's probably not what's here because that would have been the first possible scenario or the second scenario. The animal killed somebody, now it's done it again. The language of kept it in probably has something to do with him loaning the animal or selling it to somebody else, and then it kills them. And so it wasn't under his control when it happened, but he still knew better. And so notice, now we got three possible scenarios. An animal that randomly kills, an animal that's now done it twice, and now a case of an animal who's done it twice, but Joe sold his bull to somebody else. Now remember, the bull should have been dead because he did it once. But Joe kept it, Joe sold it. Now the animal's done it again. Now Joe has to pay a fine. That's what it means by a ransom. Essentially, that fine is what I've got in the notes, my notes, you label however you want, a redemption price. In other words, what's supposed to happen to that man whose animal killed another person? He's supposed to die. But the way to keep from dying in this weird scenario is Joe pays a penalty for it. Most likely, by the way, not that it's stated here, most likely the assumption is he'll pay whatever he got paid for the animal when he sold it or rented it out. So that there's no way Joe's going to profit from selling an animal that's a murderer. Following the scenarios? These are all kinds of what ifs. So, animal kills somebody, kill the animal. Animals killed multiple people, and the owner didn't take care of it the first time. Now it's happened twice. Kill the animal, kill the owner. Now, animal killed somebody, owner didn't do what he's supposed to do. Instead, he loaned it out or sold it. In other words, I don't want anything more to do with it. But he sold it, knowing that it was a problem animal. Now it's killed somebody else. He, not the new owner, is responsible because he knew what he was doing and did it anyway. And some of you going, holy cow, this stuff is really detailed when you think about it. Because what do we do as humans with the laws and rules? Let's be honest. Not only do we break them, but what do? We look for loopholes. We look for, well, what about this one? What about that? You know, my students do it to me all the time. Anybody who's ever taught, you know what has happened. Anybody who's taught Sunday school knows what it's like. All of a sudden, somebody throws something out and goes, yeah, but Dr. Beck, what about? And you stop and go, I have never had that thought in my life. What do we do about that one? You know, every once in a while, you know, what we used to call in church, stump the chump. See if you can come up with a question the pastor doesn't know the answer to. God's already doing it. He's already aware of this stuff. And so we've gone from murder to accidental murder, manslaughter, if you will, to now a violent animal, to a repeat offender violent animal, to a repeat offender violent animal with an owner who thought he was going to work the system to his favor. Now it's going to come back, no pun intended, and bite him. Okay, we've talked about the animal. What if it kills a man or a woman? Now look at verse 31. If this, then that. If occurs a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. And so now, just in case somebody wanted to, quibble over details, it doesn't matter. The rules apply whether the victim of the animal was an adult or a child. Remember, we're talking about a culture that, according to stereotypes, demeans the value of humans who aren't men. But what's he already done? He's already equated men and women. We're talking about a society that has often assumed they demean the value of children. They're lower on the food chain. What's he done here? Same thing. Doesn't matter if it kills adult, kills the grandfather, or kills the littlest kid. Same rules all apply. But more specifically, probably what he has in mind here is, what do you do if the child, male or female, son or daughter, are relatives of the owner? Right? So far, all these other laws have assumed Joe's bull went into Chris's yard and killed Chris. What happens if Joe's bull kills Joe's grandchildren in the yard? Is he off the hook because it was his family and I don't have to tell anybody? No, the rules apply there as well. And so really what you have here is a multi-layered implication. You have the fact that the children are of equal value to adults. Whether they're your kids or somebody else's kids, same rules apply, equal value, and what must happen to the animal? It's got to die. So all kinds of weird little nuanced things, most of us would have said, what? You're talking about the bull killing somebody? That's not going to happen. But obviously, if this is the first rule about animal and property rights, what must happen frequently? It's happened before. And so, getting them ready to think through the what-if scenarios. There is yet another what-if scenario at the end of the paragraph, verse 32. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. And so here, interestingly, lives of slaves lost is to be treated a little differently. Because in the financial, fiscal sense, these slaves belong to whom? To the owner. And so the loss of their lives costs him money. And so that's got to be dealt with accordingly. And so the animal must die. That's the ongoing thing here, isn't it? Regardless who it is, animal's got to die. If it's a repeat offender and Joe let him do it, Joe's got to pay on top of the animal dying. If it's killed somebody's slave, Joe, the owner, has to provide compensation for the loss of the slave to the master. Because the master's already paid his money to the slave. Remember back in those rules a couple weeks ago? Vance agrees to be a slave. The owner potentially could pay Vance up front. Vance, you got to pay off a debt. Here's your $1,000. You're going to work for me for 3 years. Joe's bull kills Vance. I've lost my $1,000. I don't have a servant, and I don't have $1,000. So what does Joe have to do? Pay me for my loss and kill the animal, which also costs Joe more money. And so all kinds of interesting what-if kinds of scenarios, all bound up in just this one unique circumstance when an animal, an oxen or a bull, gores somebody to death. The next series of codes moving forward as he's building case by case builds on the idea of owner responsibility. Right? If you're walking down a sidewalk and my sidewalk's broken and I haven't fixed it, you fall and break an ankle, who's responsible? Not. One would think, but anymore the city doesn't even put in sidewalks usually. The subdivision does, and it's part of your home. But Joe's car is not on the sidewalk. Joe's car is in the driveway. It's a bad illustration because Joe's driveway is as flat as a pancake, but let's just say hypothetically, Joe's got a little bit of a slope in his driveway, doesn't put the car all the way in park, gets out, goes inside, and I'm walking down the driveway or down the sidewalk, and Joe's car rolls downhill and hits me. Is the car at fault? Now, I may say stupid car about 1 millisecond before it hits me, but who's responsible? The owner of the car. He didn't take care of his stuff. Same thing we see occasionally in cases. It's happened here in Charleston, hopefully not in the last couple of years, but I know a few years ago, where the owner of a handgun left it on the table, a kid picked it up and killed himself. Guess what? The owner of the handgun's responsible for the death of the child. That's the kind of laws we're getting into now, where the owner bears responsibility for his property or his possessions. And so he gives some interesting potential examples, ones that don't necessarily resonate with us because we're not, most of us, country folk, or some of you who were, you haven't been in the country for a long, long time. But remember, this is a culture that everything is based on agriculture. Growing of crops, selling of crops, feeding your animals with the crops, whatever. But it's all rural type agrarian stuff. So look at verses 33 and verse 34. Again, remember, we're looking for principles here because we all don't have this particular situation in our lives, but the principles apply. When a man, not if a man, but when a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an oxen or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. And so the man owns the land, or is responsible for taking care of it, and he goes out and either uncovers a pit. It's already there. It's got a lid over it. For whatever reason, he's opened it to put stuff in it. Or if he goes out and digs it, and he fails to put a cover on it. Right? This is like if you dug a trench in your front yard, and for weeks you don't do anything about it, and somebody falls into it. Basic gist here is the owner has created a dangerous situation. Right? This is not just some sort of, Laurel and Hardy, Three Stooges, I can't remember the other guy, Charlie Chaplin-esque scene where David opens up the hole in the ground, walks away, and Kevin walks by carrying something really big. He's not looking down and steps in the hole, and he's hanging onto the ladder with his feet hanging over the hole. The picture is, you're doing your normal daily duties, you're working your work, you're working your field, you do something that everybody else is doing. This is why it's assumed. Everybody knows what he's talking about. You dig a pit, and then you take a break, or you get sidetracked. Keith is out there, he's working his field, he's dug his pit, he's getting ready to put his crop or whatever he's getting ready to bury in it, and he gets a text. And Dana wants him to bring home some fresh pork for dinner. I don't have time for this. She texts again, just to gently remind him in case he didn't get it the first time. He goes to take care of the grocery list and forgets about the pit. And then Joe comes along and his horse falls into it. It's not that Keith set out to hurt Joe's horse, but he was negligent. He's created a situation that's dangerous. And so there's got to be consequences. In the example given in this case, definitely little paragraph, just 2 verses, the animal dies because of the negligence. Not if the animal falls in and gets hurt. That's unfortunate. That's an easy one. If Joe's animal gets hurt, Joe binds it up, it heals. He doesn't take it to a vet. He doesn't have to pay Dr. Paul for the service. Joe just deals with it. But if the animal dies because of the negligence, Keith is fiscally responsible for the animal. Because remember, the animal's wealth. The animal's Joe's employee. He's now taking money out of Joe's pocket. Now Joe's got to spend more money to buy another animal, or Joe doesn't feed his family. So Keith's mistake, otherwise, is going to cost Joe money. Lots of money. And so what has to happen? The digger of the hole, or uncoverer of the hole, he has to pay for the animal. Whatever it's worth, he has to pay back. Essentially, and you notice, he gets the dead animal. He essentially buys the carcass of whatever the value of that is. So notice, it's not really punishing Keith for digging the hole and forgetting. Yeah, Keith did it. He's negligent. It was accidental. It cost Joe an animal, a work animal. Keith pays Joe for the work animal so Joe can buy another animal, but Keith gets the meat. So while it cost him 30 pieces of silver or whatever he hadn't planned on spending, Keith does get something out of it. The point here is not to punish Keith. The point here is to take care of Joe because he suffered a loss through no fault of his own. The fine, in fact, isn't higher than that because you might have expected it to be a higher penalty, right? The fine isn't higher because in one sense, the owner is partly responsible for what happened to the animal. You go, wait a minute, how's that possible? It's Keith's hole. If Joe was walking his oxen to the field, what should have Joe done? He should have been on the lookout and seen the hole. Or he walked next to it and the animal couldn't get over. Or the animal wanted to stop and Joe hit it to keep him moving. And so, rather than punishing Keith, we just make everything even. Joe gets a new animal, Keith gets dinner, if it's an animal that Keith can eat. Otherwise, Keith can probably take the skins or whatever else and sell it. And so, that's why the fine is not higher. The owner is, in one sense, responsible. His animal was in Keith's field. His animal went where he told him, and it couldn't avoid it, whatever. So, partly responsible for all this. Now, while this is a very unique scenario, and let's say you live one day down the road in Jerusalem, you're a city man, you don't have animals, and you don't have them walking through fields, and they're not going to fall in the pit, can you just ignore this law? The answer is no. Now you've got to ask, what's the principle of the law? Because the principle is going to apply to all situations, not just pits. What happens if Keith is walking down the road and David's awning falls off and breaks Keith's arm and he can't work for a week? How would the principle apply? David takes care of the work or pays for it. It's an accident. He's not at fault. Keith's not at fault. But Keith doesn't need to suffer for it. David makes it right. Or Chris grows a produce crop. He sells it to the Smiths. They take it home and get sick, and they can't work for a week. They can prove Chris did it because they've got the rotten mangoes to prove it. Chris would have to compensate for the loss. That's the principle here. You are responsible as the owner of property that does harm to somebody else, even if it's accidental. You can't just go, oops, that's bad. Those of you who've lived up north, you know this rule. People down here don't seem to because they don't deal with it very often. If it snows, I have to either do one of two things. I have to shovel my sidewalk perfectly and potentially salt it so that Jessica doesn't slip on it walking down the road with her dog, or I don't shovel it at all. But as soon as I try to clear the sidewalk, if I don't do it perfectly and she gets hurt, my fault. If there's a foot of snow on the sidewalk and she falls, it's her fault. Responsibility. We live in a day and age where no one wants to take responsibility for anything. We're all the victim and it's all somebody else's fault, even when you did it. I mean, have you seen those where, was it Monk's Corner last year? Kid broke into a house, got shot by the homeowner, and the family wanted to sue the homeowner for their loss of income for the kid. Well, yeah, I know he's breaking the law, but the owner didn't have to kill him. What's the principle? If you're the owner, you're responsible for your property. What happens on it or what happens to it or with it? Same kind of example comes in the next little paragraph, verses 35 and 36. When one man's ox butts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share the price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or, if it's known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and the owner has not kept it in, there's that phrase again, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. And so, first example, human at fault. You're the owner, you're responsible. This example covers damage done by one's animals, whether to another animal or to another human. This is not as drastic a situation of the animal killing somebody like we saw earlier. The picture here is essentially unexpected death. The first example, in fact, he gives in verse 35 is the unexpected death of one animal caused by another animal. Animals will be animals, right? If Kevin owns a bull, Christian owns a bull, no bull, they happen to be in the same field, they all of a sudden have a little testosterone fest, they charge each other, they headbutt each other. This is not a goring, this is bulls doing what bulls do. One of those animals dies, what do? Notice if you got the handout, I'll get air quotes around some of these things. The guilty animal owner, Christian, because it's his bull that lived, it's Keith's bull that dies. The guilty animal's owner has to sell the live animal. But notice, because this is not the same severity of the earlier example about the animal that gores, this time when I sell Christian's bull for him, Christian and Keith share the profit from the animal. Because it's not entirely, if you want to use the F word, fair for Christian to have to pay the whole amount for his animal doing what animals do. But he has to have some responsibility. It's not Kevin or Keith's fault that his animal got killed, so he shouldn't have to pay the whole thing. So they sell the live animal, the guilty one, split the costs. The victim, the animal that died, you sell the carcass or split it, and the two owners share those profits as well. So the net result is Christian and Keith get half a live bull's money each, and they get half of the dead animal's worth each. Now, is there still a cost to it? Yeah, right? It's like if you have insurance and your car gets totaled and the insurance company settles out and they give you the cost of the total. Unless you've got gap insurance, what did happen just to you? You just lost money. The insurance company did what it said it would do. It would cover the cost of replacing that car. But now you got to go buy another car and it's going to cost you more. You lose a little bit. That's this scenario. There's no way to make it right. But humanly speaking, neither Keith nor Christian are at fault. It just happened. And so we've got to deal with it, and they deal with it equitably. They both get half the profit. They both get half the animal that's dead. Everybody comes out somewhat ahead, if you will, in that sense. Verse 36 presents a variation on the scenario. Now it assumes that Christian's animal has a history of violence. Christian's oxen headbutts everybody's oxen. It's happened before. Christian didn't get caught, maybe. Didn't think it was that big a deal. He keeps his oxen. And then it does it again. Now Christian is at fault. His responsibility level goes up because Christian, the owner, failed to prevent the repeat incident. Right? You know that the electronic door in your store malfunctions and now it's crushed 2 people and caused injury? That's a different scenario than if one day the door malfunctioned, slammed, broke somebody's arm, and it's never happened ever again. You might pay the first one and pay the medical expense. Now all of a sudden it's happening twice and you got a class action suit. Responsibility goes up because you knew it and you didn't do anything to stop it from happening again. And so in this case, where Christian knew it and didn't stop it, now he's got to pay the other owner for the loss of his animal. We're not splitting the live animal's profit between the two owners. Christian loses out completely on the live animal. Either he sells it and gives Keith the profit, or he has to give the live animal to Keith. And so in today's terms, he just gave up $2,400 bull and gets nothing to show for it. The bull's gone. It's either Keith's or the money's Keith's. Now, it's not entirely lose-lose because at the end of the day, what does Christian get? The dead animal. Which means he could eat it. He could sell it. It's not a complete total loss on his. But again, notice the principle is the owner bears responsibility for what he should have been taking care of. In this case, the scenario again seems to be he did not keep it in. The picture is he loaned it out or sold it to somebody else. He sold it to his dad. His dad didn't know the animal had this problem. Rather than making Chris pay Keith for the loss of the animal, everybody goes, you know, that was Christian's bull and had done it before. He's got to pay the cost, not the guy he loaned it to. Another odd scenario. What happens if? If this, then that. But we're always looking for what are the principles behind it. The last one we're going to look at tonight is the beginning of chapter 22. Now, still using animals as an example, he moves into a new category of law. Because chapter 22 introduces, at least at the beginning, codes that are going to relate to the violation of the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. On the surface, that's an easy one. Don't do it. Okay, that's great, Moses. What do we do when Beth does? What do we do if we catch her doing it? What do we do if she denies it, but we find the animal in her garage? What do we do if we catch her in the act? What happens if, just say, happens, she gets killed while doing it? Now we're in the if this, then that category related to the 8th commandment. Before we go through verses 1 through 4, let me point out another interesting social concept. We've already pointed out this idea of you're responsible, and that the Jewish people clearly understood accumulating wealth was not evil. Here's another principle that's kind of here, but just not spoken. The Old Testament, in these laws and others, never once anticipates a penal system that features prisons. There's nothing in the Old Testament law that anticipates putting people in jail. Now, we're dealing with murderers. We're dealing with negligence. In this case, now we're starting to deal with theft. But nowhere do they go, you're going to go to jail for 3 years. Now, you could argue the reason that's the case is the nomadic lifestyle of Israel. You can't have jails if you don't live anywhere yet. We're always on the move. You can't have a jail. Actually, it'd be the perfect scenario. Build a jail, put Joe in it, and then leave. Let Joe deal with it, or the people there deal with it. But you could argue that's why. They're nomadic. They can't have permanent penal places. There's another way you could read that lack of penal systems. It might be that the way they're recommending here actually requires the offender, the criminal, to bear the costs of his own crime. In other words, you can't just get away with it and be sent away and go watch TV like we all complain, right? Oh, gee, you put them in jail and they go watch TV all day and work out in the gym. You know, they go to school to become better criminals while they're in jail. No. Keith lost an animal to Christian. Christian can't just go, oops, put me in jail, I guess. Christian has to pay the cost. It becomes personal, both to the offender and to the one who's been offended. Right? You ever seen, we've seen on TV shows, but I mean in the news or whatever, where somebody has committed murder and then the family members get upset because you're going to put them in jail, that's it? What's our complaint? That's not just. Or think about Hitler and all the deaths he caused in World War II, and he killed himself. Everybody goes, that's not right. He didn't pay an adequate penalty. So you could argue that the lack of jails here makes it real to the criminal as well. In fact, take that idea a step further. I think you could argue that restitution, not retribution, is the goal of the law. Because if all we do is penalize Christian by sending him to jail, and we do nothing to help Keith in his loss, who really lost? Keith. Now, I'm not saying being in jail is a piece of cake. If you got family members, I'm not saying it's a piece of cake for them. But what I'm saying is simply putting him in jail does nothing to help Keith make it right. This system says what? At the end of the day, you'll make it right. And you can't make it right if you're in jail. You know, sort of like the old concept in the 1800s and early 1900s of the pauper's prison or the debtor's prison. I mean, there was a place not far from where my mom used to live, where I grew up. We always called it Poorhouse Hill. And the idea used to be, oh, there's this big place the size of an old 19th century hospital on top of the hill. And I always thought that's where the poor people in town went to live when they were broke. No, it was Poorhouse Hill because who was in it? People who couldn't pay their debts. And so they put them essentially in minimal security prison until what? They paid their debts. But what's the problem? If you're in jail, you can't work. And so Keith goes on starving, and Christian gets his food and his room and everything provided for. So rather than retribution, punishment, restitution, the picture here seems to be that the law here is to make the law abider's life better, not just make the offender's life worse. Think about it. Isn't that what Paul says in Romans when he talks about the government and the sword? The government bears a sword not to make the law abider scared, but to keep the lawbreaker from going after the law abider. You know, that's one of those weird things. To serve and protect is often on a lot of police cars. To serve us and protect us, what must they do? Make the criminals, A, stop if they can, or B, pay the consequences of their crime. Because otherwise, if the criminals would just stay away, my life's good. I don't want the government in my house for anything. But when it happens, merely arresting the guy who broke into my house and not replacing what he stole from me, I'm being punished also. And so the picture here seems to be restitution, not just retribution, not just punishment or penalty. All right, bearing that in mind, let's look at the what ifs. Verse 1, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, and he kills it or sells it, notice alternatives. It's this animal or that animal, this action or that action. He shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. And so, in the case of theft, 8th commandment, the criminal must repay his victims. We know who it is. He's been caught. He has to pay for it. Whether it's been merely stolen or killed, sold, whatever. It has to be paid for. But notice there's a penalty attached to that repayment. Christian steals an ox. He doesn't merely give back 1 ox. What must he do? Pay back 5 times. If he steals a sheep, he pays back 4 times. The point is, in one sense, tongue-in-cheek, crime really does pay. But it pays the victim. Because if Keith has been victimized, getting back 1 animal is great. But that doesn't compensate for Keith's grief, struggle, PTSD, whatever. Right? You talk to people whose homes have been broken into. What do they usually tell you? It's not the stuff, it's the peace of mind I've lost. And so the criminal's got to pay, but there's a penalty on top of the repayment. So he's not merely getting away with it. This is not a slap on the wrist. Okay, Christian, you stole a pack of bubble gum from the store. Go back and give him $1 for the bubble gum. No, you got to now pay 5 packs of bubble gum. There's a penalty to this. Now, some of you are thinking, okay, 5 oxen for an ox. Why only 4 sheep for a sheep? It's not clear in the text. But one potential answer is sheep, more so than oxen, do have a tendency to roam away. Right? I mean, Jesus talks about leaving the 99 to go find the one. We'll talk about, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the picture of the shepherd does what? He's got this rod and the staff. One of them is meant to beat off the animals who are attacking his sheep. What's the other one for? Keep the sheep in line. And so it might be that there's a risk here that, yeah, we could say Christian sold 4 sheep, but unless you saw Christian with 4 sheep under his arm like the old Looney Tune cartoons, it's possible that Christian did what? Took 1 sheep or 3 sheep. And so one potential answer here is sheep just have a tendency, you don't know for a fact that he stole all of them. Or it simply could be the fact that sheep are much more procreative than oxen. And so the loss is not as great as if you lost a prize bull. That would be another way to go at it. But I thought the idea that sheep wandering away was more of an interesting take on that for some people's arguments. And so he does it, he pays, and he pays with a penalty. But some more what ifs. Verse 2, heading into verse 3. If a thief is found breaking in, and he's struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun is risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. We're going to stop there. Those 2 pieces go together. The rest of verse 3 actually belongs to another thought. So verse 2 on into verse 3a, the first half of verse 3, another what if. So he's broken in to steal. This time we've caught him in the act. Now what do? The first one assumed Christian thought he got away with it. We caught him. Either selling the animal, keeping the animal, whatever. What if he gets caught in the act? Well, it depends. 2 options. In the event that the crime takes place at night, the owner can use deadly force to defend himself. In fact, it says that the owner would not be guilty of murder if he killed the thief who's broken in. Thief hadn't even stolen anything yet. He's broken in to steal. He gets killed in the process. The owner does not have blood guilt. He didn't murder him. He's going to walk, if you will, scot-free. On the other hand, if the crime takes place during the day, once the sun has come up, and he kills him, now the owner is guilty of murder. Because during the day, deadly force is not authorized. Now the owner has become the criminal. Why? Remember, we're talking a pre-electrical light world. We're talking a world where you have lamps. You could turn the lamp down, but they didn't have old crank lamps like we think of. You turn the lamp down by pulling the wick further into the oil. Or you simply put the lamp out at night. So you hear somebody in your house in the middle of the night, you wake up, guess what you cannot do? See. Plus, your mind is groggy, your thoughts are fuzzy. There's a good chance you overreact. And you accidentally kill them in reacting to protect you or your family. Now we're back to accidental death. In this case, only because the guy crawled into your house. It's not what he deserved, but it's the consequences of his own actions. But if he does it during the day, and you see who he is, and you know what he's doing, and you kill him anyway, now it's on you. Because you went too far. Right? It's sort of like some of the laws today that if the criminal's in your house and you shoot him, it's one thing. But if the criminal's been in your house and is running down the driveway away from you, and you shoot him in the back, it's a different thing. And you go, what's the difference? 20 seconds. Right? Think of the cop in North Charleston with the guy at the corner there on Remount and Rivers. Had the police officer shot the man when the man was trying to grab his gun point blank, he'd be a free man today. Why isn't he? Because the man ran away and he shot him in the back when he was no longer in danger. Now, we could say, man, I understand why, the adrenaline, but it's a different scenario at that point. And so, breaking in at night, deadly force. That's not preferable, but it's understandable. Breaking in during the day, deadly force goes out the window. So, here's an interesting case where we're talking about thieves, and we're talking about the owner's responsibility. Verse 3b, the rest of verse 3, picks up the rest of the concept he'd already been talking about. It's like the first part we just covered was an aside. Now he's back to what he was driving at. We're now back to the criminal. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, so he's been caught during the day, he, the criminal, shall surely pay. If he has nothing, if he's poor, and that's why he's stealing, then he shall be sold for his theft. So if he's caught in the act, the thief has to pay. And notice, even if he's dirt poor, it's not an excuse for thievery. It doesn't allow for situational ethics where, man, my family's starving, then it's okay to go rob a store. Never. That's breaking the commandment. So if he gets caught in the act, he's got to pay. If he's so poor that he can't pay to replace what he stole, he has to be sold into slavery. And the money he would have gotten for his service is now given to his victim. So it's a work farm kind of situation, if you will, versus just simply sitting in jail. So there's another what if. One more what if here, and then we're done for the night. If the stolen beast, and that was what the original presupposition was, well, if he stole an ox or sheep, if the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it's an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. And so here's more nuance to the law. If the thief still has the goods, he's not fenced it, he's not sent it away and sold it, he still has it, notice his penalty is double what it would have been otherwise. I think what's going on here is based on what it says in verse 4, that penalty at the end of verse 3, talking about paying it or being sold to slavery for it, implies that if the criminal had sold the goods, he would have not only had to replace the goods, but paid any profit he made for the goods. So if I stole Kevin's car, sold the car, I get caught, I have to pay Kevin for the car and give up any profits I made. Because remember, I'm not going to jail. Right? This is the whole Al Parrish thing several years ago when he embezzled, right? He embezzled $100 million. But he used it to buy stuff and invest in other stuff for himself. Would it have been just for him to pay back the $100 million only to the people he stole it from, but he got to keep $30 million worth of stuff he bought? And so I think the nuance here is, if you get caught and you sold it, you got to pay what you stole and pay what you made. So you're going, well, then I'm never going to sell stolen goods. That's bad. I'll just keep what I steal. Verse 4 says what? If you keep what you steal, you pay double. So at the end of the day, crime doesn't pay at all. You can't steal it and keep it, you double. You can't steal it and sell it because now you got to replace the animal and the profit. And by the way, if I stole Kevin's car, it's worth $5,000, and I sold it for $5,000, I get caught, I have to give Kevin $5,000 for the car. What else do I have to give Kevin? The $5,000. What is it? It's basically I'd pay double. So either way, I don't come out ahead. In fact, I'd be smarter if I was going to do it to sell it and maybe sort of break even. I pay Kevin $5 out of pocket and $5 out of the sale. This way, if I keep it, I pay Kevin 10 straight up. I got nothing. What if? If this, then that. When the Ten Commandments says, don't steal, okay, what do we do when people break it? Here are some examples of that. They'll continue on next week. Don't forget, we're back in the book of Mark this Sunday, continuing to work our way through the Gospel of Mark, thinking through Jesus' teaching, seeing how he proves Mark's point. But let's go ahead and pray and get out of here. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your goodness, your mercy. Pray, Lord, your blessing on our time as we go home. May it be a time of sweet fellowship for those who came with other people. May it be a time, Lord, of reflection on those we've been praying for or the Bible study that we've just completed. But in it all, Lord, we pray that you'd use these things to turn our attention to you, to focus on you as the source of all of our needs, the source of all our hope. And it's for all this we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.